Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be here. I spoke here a few years ago. Is that right? And you were in a church?
Yes, when I was in the testing phase and didn't know if I was going to do it or not. You were
Oh.
one of my first speakers.
Well, I liked it very much. And I think my book had not come out yet then, or it was just coming out. So that would have been about 2017 or 18, before the pandemic. And I really appreciated being here and speaking to you. Today, I brought two books with me. This is a big mess. This is the proof copy of my book. I have some clean copies if anyone would want to buy one. Whoops.
Don't forget about the people here.
Okay. Hello. And and I also brought a friend's book because at when Ingrid invited me to speak, I was a little uncertain about what I wanted to talk about. I know that you are writers of of both genres, prose and poetry, and so I wanted to give poetry a little sales talk. And what I wanted to title my talk was "Less is More." And being from Chicago, I guess that's a very familiar phrase in Chicago. It was sort of the byword of the architect Mies van der Rohe, who designed many of our skyscrapers. Then I looked up Mies and read about him on Wikipedia, and he's known for these skyscrapers, but some of them are also known as being very cold and distant, the exact opposite of what we want our poetry to be. So I'm not going to use that title for this talk, Less is More. However, I still would like to read a short poem by a friend. And something that I do like about poetry is that it is so succinct and efficient, and you can say so much in so few words. Now, I tested this idea on my husband, who is sitting to my left, Randall Cronk, and he passed with flying colors. So, you might be getting the impression that there will be questions. There's a test coming up. And the name, if I may go ahead, the name of the book is Get Up, Said the World, and my friend's name is Gail Gepfert, and she's from Chicago. The name of this poem is Tete-a-Tete at Trader Joe's. Tightly tucked petals of peony buds, tightly tucked petals of peony buds bob in the plastic tub. I nearly missed them. An older woman with a bright face stands by her walker, holding a fistful of stems, and I backtrack, sensing I've found someone else who crushes on them. Do you know the secret to getting peonies to bloom? I ask. I've tried everything to resurrect the ones I purchased elsewhere. Try these, she says. Cut the stems at the deepest angle possible. Put them in room temperature water, not warm, not cold. They'll open. As she describes the bounty of peonies in her yard, her eyes light. But she's lost her husband, needs to move. She knows she does because she can't afford to stay, and she's 84, and it's hard to be transplanted, and her son's down the aisle somewhere, in from Philadelphia. And finally I say, I can't really buy any today because I'm going out of town. I'll mind them for you. Call me and tell me you're the lady in Trader Joe's, and I'll remember, I will. And we stand together in our own vortex of bloom love, deciding which colors to rescue, the pale pink or the raspberry sorbet. And I open my phone and enter her name. Jane Horowitz, she says, witch, like the one on the broomstick. I move on when her son wheels up with his cart, as he's likely to be troubled that his mother's given her number to a stranger. So I say goodbye. And as I reach for pretzel bread and bananas not far away, I hear him say, "No." And I hear her reply, "But I'll pay for them. I will. I'll pay." And that's the end. Now, here comes the test. My contention is that in that poem, we learned about characters, we learned about details of the setting, we learned a little bit about plot. So my first question is, can anybody tell me the characters? Who was in this poem? Oh, I see a hand, yes.
Well, the flowers are a character.
Oh, now that is really poetic. Okay.
But also, I mean, you have the two, I'm assuming the speaker is a woman, so you have the two women and the flower as the third character that really kind of brought them together.
I love that. That wasn't the answer my husband gave. You get an A plus. What about the woman, the older woman? What can you tell me about her? Anybody? What was her name? Yes, Jane Horowitz. Yes. And what does she like? What is one thing that she likes that we know?
She loves flowers.
She loves flowers, yes. And what's her place in life? Where is she? What's happening with her? She's transitioning. She's suffered losses recently. And how about, I'm not going to bring up the flowers, although that's a great character. What about the stranger? What does she, anything about her that we know? The woman, the narrator of the poem.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Kindness.
That's what I thought too. She's kind, yes. What about the son? Busy, yes, probably busy, maybe a little bit cold, yeah. But also, he is there to help. He came in from Philadelphia, I think. What about the plot? Oh, yes.
Go back to the son. I have grandchildren, and because I'm past 70, they think I'm a little off sometimes.
Oh, yes.
When he's thinking about his mother, talking to strangers.
Yeah.
I'm trying to protect you. You gotta protect yourself. You can't be talking to strangers. You can't pass your phone number.
Right, exactly, exactly.
But the fact that he flew in from somewhere else kind of shows that he doesn't maybe have that connection with her to know her well.
Right, but he also did come into town to look after her, yeah. So we've got sort of a complicated personality there, some characteristics that sort of contradict themselves, but not entirely. We all have many sides to ourselves.
We don't know why he's really here.
The plot thickens.
Just because he takes care of his mother doesn't mean that he likes the world.
Right.
He could be close, and probably wherever he's from. Like when you go to New York City, when I walk the street, nobody looks you in the eye.
Oh, they don't speak.
No,
That's only in New Orleans.
New Orleans.
Yeah, South, especially New Orleans.
Yeah.
Everybody speaks.
That's true. That's true. When we first moved here, Randy came down ahead of me with his nephew, and they were in our house, and his nephew went out for a walk, and he came back and he said, they're from Chicago. He says, I don't like this. He says, everybody's talking to me, and they're all saying hello.
Hello,
how you doing?
How's your mom and them?
I think you said a lot more than what I was expecting. Your answers were great. I thought for a plot, I just said that it's left open to the reader's imagination. Will the elderly woman stand up to her son? Will the son back down? Will the stranger follow through and pick up the peonies when she returns from out of town? Now, I know part of that answer because I called my friend to ask her if it was okay if I read her poem and discussed it here. And she said, oh, I'd love if you'd read it. She said, I still have that woman's phone number in my phone. But she didn't tell me if she called her or not. So now I'm going to read from my book. And my novel is a woman, and I only want to read parts of it because what I'd like to emphasize today is the Christian part. And I know that many of the things that you do are inspirational. I listen to your talk online, and I don't think that this book is inspirational. This is the main character in the book is a woman who more doubts her faith. She expresses her doubts, but she is always sustained by God's love. And to the end of the book, we see that. And I've been asked, is it about my real grandmother? Well, this book is all true. I made it up myself. So,
it came to the reader. They don't know. I love it.
And actually, it is somewhat factual. I have to read from my notes here. It's sort of the story of my German-American grandmother, based on fact, conjecture, and imagination, woven together with a few logical suppositions. Like Sylvia, that's the main character in the book, my own grandmother was born and bred in a small Iowa town, and also, like Sylvia, my grandparents and their only child, a son, who was later to become my father, moved to Chicago when the boy, my father, was about 9 years old. So in some ways, the main character was a true person. In other ways, she's almost entirely a product of my imagination. One aspect that is true is her relationship with God, or perhaps it would be more accurate for me to say her relationship with the church, which I could more clearly see as she moved through life. And she did have problems, much like the woman in this book. Her husband had been unfaithful to her, I know, in the early years of her marriage. Her son, my father, died as a very young man. He was only 33 when he was killed in Chicago. And that was her only child, so she was pretty much on her own. And her husband died too. In fact, I always refer to him as, I realized this as I was preparing for this, I always refer to him as my grandmother's husband because I never knew him. He had died before I was born. What I would like to do is read a few of the poems in the book, and I brought handouts. My husband, they're not in, my teacher's assistant is going to hand them out. And they're not in, they got out of order somehow when I was at Mailboxes Are Us. I think there are about, if we need more copies, I've got something I can give to Ingrid here. These are the originals. Is that okay? You just have to hunt through them a bit. But everybody has to hunt through them because they got out of order.
Everybody's got one.
And the book begins at a wedding. And so I brought, partly because the book begins at a wedding, and partly because I want you all to like me.
She's honest. She's honest. That's the truth.
My husband's going to pass these out. Little wedding candies. It worked once before when I was in second grade and having trouble making friends. My mother decided to send me to school with she sent me to school with little bags of candy to pass out to the other kids. And it worked like a charm for a few days. And then my mom said, you know, this is so unhealthy. So she substituted, instead of candy, she put carrot sticks in the bag. My popularity took a nosedive. But I hope that doesn't happen today.
You didn't bring carrot sticks.
No carrot sticks today. I'd like to start with a poem. I think I'll read it from the book. In fact, I do have. I'd like to start when my grandparents came to Chicago. they did become, they were saved. They went to a Baptist church. And they had been Lutherans, I believe, which is kind of a little colder church, but they went to a Baptist church. And so I'd like to read First Steps on a Spiritual Journey. I think that's right on the top. And in this poem, Sylvia herself is speaking, and they're in Chicago, and the year is 1925. With every head bowed and every eye closed and no one looking around, the preacher told us to raise a hand to show if we'd turned our life over to Jesus. Seems like everybody's hands shot up. Everybody's except mine and Will's. We both peeked. Peeked at the packed church, peeked at each other. First thing we've done it together in years, truth be told. Held hands, in fact, as Jesus touched our souls and called us forward to accept him as our personal Savior. I'd like to skip from that to Born Again. And I'm going to, this is such a long one, I think I'll skip a few stanzas in it. The stanzas that are in italics are Will speaking. The whole poem is by Will. It's him speaking. And it's, again, 1925. He's in Chicago. And he's just talking. He's just telling us this. But when I get to the italicized verses, that's where he's talking about his specific sins. I think we can skip that. We're Lutherans, I'd told Mitch, the fellow down at the streetcar barns where I'm working now. He'd been pestering me to try his church. We don't go in much for the hooping and hollering of you born-again Baptists. "Oh, shucks," he'd said, "just come once." So there I was last Sunday, sitting in a pew with Mitch and his wife, and Sylvia and Sebastian, listening with one ear, thinking with the other. Thinking, truth be told, about my past, about how I'd made such a mess of things with my jealousy and my anger. When, what do you know? Jesus himself reaches down, grabs me by the shoulders, and turns me full face around. Before I knew it, everybody was standing, singing from the hymn book, "Just as I am, and waiting not, to rid my soul of one dark blot." And over the voices, the preacher was talking, inviting folks to go forward, up to the front of the church, to pray with him and with the deacons, and to let Jesus into our hearts. But I tell you, the preacher was too late. Jesus had already taken a hold of me and was pulling me out of the pew, down the aisle. I'd tried to resist. Fact is, I even reached for Sylvie to hold me back. But she came too, followed me, followed Jesus. When I got to the front of the church, I told the preacher it was all a mistake. I told him I was a sinner and that I'd left a terrible wake of misery and despair behind me. "And that's where it'll stay," he said, "behind you." "What's ahead?" I asked, hoping for forgiveness from everyone I'd hurt. Now I'd like to skip the next few stanzas. You can read them later if you like. Move ahead to, the preacher didn't seem to be listening to the listing of my sins. All he said was, "They're not yours alone now. They're not yours alone anymore. Jesus walks beside you now. Share your burdens with him. He'll help you carry them." And you know what? Sure as shooting, the terrible heaviness that had been squeezing my heart loosened its grip. Sylvie, Sebastian, and I were surrounded by friendly faces, folks telling us how happy they were for us. I was too, happy for us. Thank you.
Wow. You can see
Very
that.
good.
You can really see this.
Thank you. The next one I'd like to read, I think you have to hunt in it, is called Fat Years. And in this one, Sylvia is having some problems. And she refers back to one of her husband's sins. She calls it catting.
Oh, fat years.
Years, yes, fat years. Excuse my accent. It should be in there somewhere. You can read over my shoulder if it's not. Okay. And she refers in it to a sin of Will's that she has trouble forgiving, and that was his unfaithfulness. She refers to it as catting around or catting about. Catting, yes, that's. And this is 1929, so it's about 4 years later, and it's Sylvia speaking. Yes, God's been good to us for a change. Will's earning a fair wage, been made a foreman over at the car barns. Living the straight and narrow, far as I can tell. Not that I see him much any more than I used to, now that he's such a bigwig at that church of ours. Yes, for all their talk about marriage, the purity of the conjugal bed, the husband's position at its head, you'd think these people would have a good sight more sense than to lure a man out, night after blessed night, deacon or not. Yes, he's a deacon. Ministers to the poor and sick and otherwise bereft. Attends every service the church holds, and then some. Tuesday night visitation, Wednesday night prayer meeting. Deacons meet at 7 on Thursday nights. Only for an hour, so those that are in the choir can get to the 8 o'clock practice. Well, these years since we got religion have been a whole sight better than when he was out catting about. I was already used to the loneliness. Thank God I'm not jealous of Jesus. I'd like to go next to Will speaking, and that's called Saturday Chores. And in this poem, he's talking about a little bit about his religion and also about his marriage with Sylvie, which has been. Oh, I hope so. Saturday Chores.
Oh, there it is.
Oh,
okay. I'm sorry, they're so out of order.
It's okay.
I came home from the copying shop, all excited. I told Randy, I said, I went to the copying shop and it was so easy. I just put these in and they all came out stapled and everything. Yeah. So they have. He was unfaithful at that one time, and everything has not been rosy for them. Especially as you'll see in the bedroom. So this is 1933, a few years later, and this is right after the Great Depression. I don't know if any of you were brought up by parents who lived through it, and my mother mentioned it all the time as she was rinsing out cans and bottles and making sure she used every single bit. This is Wilt speaking, and he says, times have been tough hereabout, all about. Decent men losing jobs, decent men riding the rails. Keeps me counting my blessings, I'll tell you. Me and my crew down at the streetcar barns are needed, thank God, more than ever now. Our tinkering with those trolley cars keeps them on the tracks, crisscrossing through the city, and keeps us and ours out of the bread lines. Quitting time is noon on Saturdays. Next stop for me is the church office, to meet with Pastor James and help him with the Sunday bulletin. He watches as I pick out the letters on the underwood, keeps his hands clean while I wrap the master on the mimeograph's cylinder and run off 100 copies for the next day's service. Today, I was so bold after he'd gone, after I'd scrubbed my hands, as to page through the index of his concordance Bible. Marriage, love, husband, wife, till I found something promising. 5th chapter of Proverbs, verse 18. Rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Be thou ravished. Fact is, I'd been feeling my oats, thinking maybe some Bible quotes might help me in persuading Sylvie to enjoy an evening with me sometime. So tonight, as I climbed into bed, I brought my Bible along, carried it under my arm like I was going somewhere important. And it did bring a smile right off, the sight of me in my pajamas carrying that Bible. I settled in, and in my good book voice commenced to read. Let thy fountain be blessed, which gave her the giggles. And I knew then that she knew then where I was heading. The Bible does have a nice way of putting things. I'd never thought of my fountain as blessed. I chuckled too, then plowed on. Rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Sylvie sighed. I lowered my voice, murmured, let her be as the loving and pleasant. Here I stopped. Started again. As the loving and pleasant. Pleasant what? She asked. Doe, I faltered, like a deer. And God Almighty, she laughed. And I knew I was soon to succeed. Let her breasts satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Then, as she let her guard down and lifted her nightie up, the book slipped from my hands. So we've got some sex in this book.
Tastefully done.
The next one I'd like to read is, it's got a bad word in it. It's, we've gathered together. And oh, this is a sad part. Something sad has happened. This is after the death of their son. Her husband has died, and Will has died, and then their son does die. I hate to tell you what happens. I hope you still buy the book and read it. And this is the pastor's wife, Pastor James Bergstrom. His wife's name is Cora, and this is 12 years later, 1945. So the pastor's wife is speaking, and she says, my husband says, as a Christian, one is obligated to accept the loss of one's only child, much as our Lord accepted the death of his only begotten Son. Not necessarily with cheer, but with equanimity, not at the least to reject the church and the condolences and casseroles of its comforting congregation. But I say, who the hell are we to judge the depth of her sorrow? And more on the difficulties that Sylvia has, solace in saloons. And this is Sylvia talking, and it's a year later, 1946, and she's still having trouble accepting the death of, mostly of her son. Take up your bed, Jesus said to the lame man, and walk. Stop at Johnny's is the voice I hear. It won't hurt, might help to have a beer or two. I obey that voice, and for a few hours I forget. I forget that Sebastian died. I forget that God forsook me. I must have passed this place 1,000 times and never thought to go in, have a beer or two. Who would begrudge me a few beers before I go home? no one but that little Italian, Josie, that's Sebastian's wife who's living with her, who has now taken it upon herself to preach to me, inviting me to go to church with her and Emmy, telling me I should be keeping the faith for Sebastian's sake, makes my blood boil, makes me want another beer just thinking about it. I should have said that at that point that Sebastian had married, his wife is Josie. He married a woman that Sylvia did not approve of. She was an Italian, and Sylvia did not approve of that. I have one in here. It's called So Far, So Good. It's Sebastian's wife speaking, Josephine Graziano Grunwald. And this is same year, 1946, and she also is having a hard time. And she had left the Catholic Church when she married Sebastian and went to the Protestant Church. And in its very word, Protestant, you hear protest, and we know that that's what Protestantism was about, protesting many of the things in the Roman Catholic Church. And so Josie did embrace the Protestant Church, but here we have her thinking back to her roots a little bit. And their little girl's name is Emmy. So far, on Sundays, I succeed in dressing both myself and Emmy. Entering the church is hard. I am a Baptist now, a protester of the mumbo-jumbo of Catholicism. And yet, in this time of torment, even in the light, bright field of friendly faces, of meaningful hymns and sympathetic smiles, I yearn. I yearn for a silent sanctuary, for dim, flickering candles, for the faint smell of incense. I yearn for the distant and yet watchful saints, gazing down on me from dark recesses carved into thick, ponderous walls. I yearn for the assurance that the Virgin Mary is beseeching her Son on my behalf, imploring him to comfort me. Even as I stand to join the congregation and sing of how marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me, I yearn. I yearn for muted chants, tinkling bells, whispered prayers, the near sound of rosary beads slipping through fingers. The preacher pounds the pulpit, waves his Bible, touches hearts and minds. And I yearn for unintelligible Latin, murmured by black-robed priests. In remembrance of Jesus, of the Last Supper, I eat the bread and drink the grape juice as it is passed to me, all the while craving the wafer that became his flesh and blood when the priest laid it on my tongue. As we open our Bibles and read directly from God's Word, I pray that the saints are interceding for me, speaking of me to God himself. Water cascades down the faces and runs from the hair of the newly baptized, and I want only to wet my fingers in a few drops of holy water, lift it to my forehead, bless myself with the sign of the cross. So far, the memory of marrying Sebastian in the Flournoy Avenue Baptist Church has sustained me, held me in the hollow of its hand. So far, so good. Do I have time to go on? Can I go on interminably?
You can go until about noon, and then we'll see.
Are we getting close?
No, it's 11:20.
Oh, my watch says It's the battery's out. It says 6:30.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Well, the next one I'd like to read is called Moving Out. And this one, it's not so directly about faith at all, but it does reference a Bible story. And I thought that I put it in here because it's an example of how much the Bible is part of our culture, our whole culture, and how we can say things sometimes we don't have to always explain. So I think that maybe this will do it. This is Sylvia speaking. It's a few years later, 1948. And Sylvia is the German grandmother herself. And she starts out with kind of a bad word. In fact, we weren't allowed to say it in our house, but she starts out, that wily wop. She waited until she packed boxes and cases to tell me she and the child are moving out. But of all the things to leave unpacked, folded on the bed, never used, that quilt of mine, handmade, sewed by the church ladies, in the wedding ring pattern, for all the brides in my day. She left the quilt I'd dug out of my hope chest and given her and Sebastian after they ran off and got married. Moving on, she put it, leaving me alone. Moving up, she said, to a second-floor apartment on Harrison Street. Moving away, she repeated, from the gloom and doom and memories of our basement flat. Leaving me. I'm no Ruth, she said, walking out the door. As if I ever thought she was or could be.
Much love for her.
Now I have one that there is an issue in the book of African American people and white people and conflicts. And this is one of the first ones. And this is Sylvia speaking. And this is 1952 now. And white flight has started in Chicago. White people are moving to the suburbs. And Sylvia has not moved to the suburbs. But she's the African American woman who moved in next door to her. She likes her very much. They like each other. In fact, they become close friends till their deaths. And Sylvia is speaking of Lillian Burton. She says, little Miss Burton couldn't be nicer, even though she is colored. I don't hold her son's actions against her. But why she let him marry a white woman, I'll never know. So that's sort of the beginning of some of the conflicts that do go on. That was Miscegenation. I'm sorry, that was a real short one. Another one I'd like to read is Grandparents' Day. And this is when, and this is pretty much based on fact, Chicago is a very racist city. And I mean, now we talk about systemic racism. I never knew what that really meant, but I did live it. Redlining in Chicago and realtors who would put up for sale signs willy-nilly so that white people would leave and they would sell them houses in the suburbs, and it was all very contrived and violent sometimes. Anyway, Sylvia has not moved. She's been pretty much left behind, but the daughter-in-law has moved, Josie and Emmy, and the church moved even. So Sylvia's really been left behind. Grandparents' Day. Well, I did just that. I took the bus. I accepted Emmy's invitation to Grandparents' Day. Hopped on the Sunday school bus, bound for, at one time, was the Flournoy Avenue Baptist Church of Chicago, but now is the Melrose Park Baptist Fellowship, and will someday be whatever newfangled name they come up with in whatever suburb is still white enough for the likes of them. No matter. Seems I'm no longer a member. Seems my 7-year absence has turned me into a visitor. Yes, soon's I walked in the door, they slapped a name tag on me. Had it all filled out beforehand. Visitor. Sylvia Grunwald, grandma of Emily Grunwald. Grandma. As if they couldn't make the effort to write out grandmother. As if that didn't make me feel like a codger. Worse yet, Emmy'd signed me up for the older adults Sunday school class. Yes, right after the morning service, where the preacher'd ranted on about the sin of prejudice, no less, she sends me off with a pack of old farts. I knew practically all of them, mostly the same folks as been in the young adults and then the adults classes with me years ago. Of course, now they're a bunch of fancy-hatted women and pot-bellied men. Bald Howard, pompous as ever, hairless as ever, offered his arm to me. Like as not, it was him who needed someone to lean on. Make matters worse, as we're hobbling along, he tells me they're starting in again that very morning on the book of Job. Thinking back to Pastor James and his convoluted attempts to make sense of Job's trials and tribulations, I near to groaned out loud. Grandparents' Day, my eye. At least she didn't say that other word. I'd like to read another one. This one's Speaking of Tongues. And this is the pastor speaking on that day, that same day, the Grandparents' Day. And he has not met Sylvia because, I failed to say this earlier, she had left the church for 7 years after her son was killed. She was bitter. And this also speaks to the issue of white flight. Speaking of Tongues by Reverend David Bernhard. I am David, slayer of giants, I assured myself when Emily presented me to her grandmother, the legendary Sylvia Grunwald, she of the sharp tongue, whose scathing derision of my predecessor, the Reverend James Bergstrom, straight-laced, two-faced, sanctimonious hypocrite, is credited with catapulting him back to the Borneo mission field. As we spoke, I extended the right hand of fellowship. My left hand in my pocket fingered the 5 smooth stones carried for just such encounters by all slayers of giants. As a 10-year-old boy, I was skeptical when my mother named the then rough rocks. Friendship, humility, compassion, kindness, and obedience. And furious when she confiscated the newly purchased slingshot that would have propelled them straight at the head of the schoolyard bully. Now, as Pastor David, I find them useful to empower me in the face of adversity. I used 2 for my encounter with Sylvia: humility and compassion. A miracle. She seemed to like me. She was receptive to my plea that she return to the fold. But her reaction to the sermon I delivered this morning on the sin of racial prejudice did invite a tongue lashing. Maybe I will come back. Just keep those buses running down into my neighborhood, she mocked, where a person actually has to practice what you're only preaching out here in the lily-white suburbs. Oh, she'll be a handful, I'm sure. Her tongue is sharp. I think I can stand it. Stand up to it when need be, as long as it isn't forked. So, I'd like to go to Mamma Mia. Which is this is 1958. The granddaughter is older, maybe high school, and still living apart from. Sylvia's still in the city in Chicago, and she's still angry with her daughter-in-law for being Italian, and raising the granddaughter in the Italian neighborhood in Chicago, but now out in the Italian suburb, Melrose Park, I believe. But something is happening here. She says, why in tarnation Josie would allow her daughter, my granddaughter, while Emmy's still in high school, no less, to leave the United States, I'll never know. For heaven's sake, both Josie's people and mine spent their last Deutschmarks, or whatever it is they use for money in Italy, getting themselves over here. And now she lets Emmy up and go across the Atlantic on a plane, no less, traveling with relatives. I asked their names, and for the life of me, all I could make out was Gooma this and Gooma that. Ha, just as I thought. All of them a bunch of Goombas. Well, if I have anything to say about it, this will be the last time Emmy pulls a stunt like this. And where is she off to? Italy, of course. I'll be learning the language, she said, as if she didn't get enough of that growing up on Chicago's west side. I tell you, one time, I took the bus home from their old apartment over on Taylor Street, and sure as shooting for the whole ride, I had to listen to two of them, Italians, in the seat right behind me, jabbering away in that lingo of theirs. That's really how my grandmother talked.
Aggressive in one respect. Not having the attack.
Yes, I'd like to go to Silver Lining. She's something that Sylvia perceives as a good thing is about to happen. Her granddaughter is graduating from college, and she's going to Germany. To just a course that she's taking. And so Sylvie's not entirely happy. She doesn't like it when anybody leaves and goes anywhere, but at least it's Germany. So this time, I have to ask my husband how to pronounce a word. Maybe it's not in here. Veilflicken. How do you say that?
Veil. It's spelled with a W. They pronounce it as a V.
Okay, I think we come to that in the next one. So this is Silver Lining, and Sylvia speaking. Again, she's a little disgruntled. Emmy no sooner graduates from college and comes home to Chicago than she's gone again, off to some institute. She's turning into one of those professional students, if you ask me. Well, this time I do believe the little mama's cooked her own goose, allowing Emmy out of the country to study at the Goethe Institute, which, by the way, no one has ever heard of. Not one of the ladies in Missionary Guild Society, and no one in the older adult Sunday school class. Leastways, she's in Germany this time, where, God willing, she'll learn a thing or two about her father's side of the family. Maybe she'll find herself a nice husband, I told her. Bring him back here. Have herself some nice German babies. Start getting the Hafner-Grunwald bloodline cleaned up. She is... No, she doesn't. I'd like to go from there to confronting the enemies. It's kind of a long one. And in this one, she has heard from from Emmy. Emmy's in Germany, And Emmy is happy. She's fallen in love with a man who is tall, dark, and handsome. Unfortunately, he's a black man. Or unfortunately for Sylvie. And
He's
Tall, dark, and
yeah, there you go. Tall, dark, and handsome.
and it turns out that he knew Emmy as a child because he is Lillian Burton's grandson, and Emmy is Sylvia's granddaughter, and they knew each other when Lillian and Sylvia, yeah, Lillian's the woman who moved in next door, and Emmy was over in Germany. I don't remember what I wrote in this story, but I think the boy, Henry is his name, I think, was in the army, and they ran into each other. So this is kind of long. And also, one more thing for those of you who are too young to remember. It used to be when we had phones, they were phones that were in your house. They were landlines, and they were dial telephones. And you could dial 0, and the operator would answer. And she would help you. It was information. And then if you also needed a number, you could dial 411. And so operator was help, I believe, and 411 was the information. It was the Google of that day. So Sylvia has just received a letter from Emmy saying that she's fallen in love with this tall, dark, and handsome man. And guess what, Grandma? She said, you know him. It's Henry, Lillian Burton's grandson. Well, Sylvia says, well, don't think I didn't march right over to Mrs. Burton's. Letter in hand, ready to bet dollars to donuts she already knew what her grandson was up to. I grew annoyed, then worried when Lillian didn't answer my knock. She may have a grandson who doesn't know his place, but she's a lady through and through. I hurried back to my apartment, chipped a nail dialing O for the operator. I told her the whole story about Emmy and the colored boy, and that Mrs. Burton lives in the apartment right next to mine, and that she's always home at this time of day, and that she doesn't have a phone, and that her son and his wife moved out, and that she lives alone now, and that something must be wrong for her to not answer the door. And do you know what that worthless piece of humanity did? Told me to get a hold of the son, and disconnected. Madder than a wet hen by then, I dialed 411, and that operator, cool as a cucumber, as though something of this sort happens every day, said, information, how may I help you? And wouldn't you know it, she found 80 Burtons in Chicago alone, and I couldn't for the life of me remember Lillian's son's first name. Then I realized I still had Emmy's letter in my hand. Henry, I read from the scribbles. See if there's a Henry Burton Sr. And sure enough, the boy's named after his father. Mrs. Burton is coming along fine, staying with me until she can get back on her own. I've got her in my bed with pillows propped under the foot she broke in her fall. But where will you sleep? She asked. As if I don't have a perfectly good couch. Some ladies from her church bring food around, colored food. It was greens and cornbread tonight. None for me, I told them. But then I did have me a plateful. Don't want to be rude. As for Emmy, I've half a mind to get on a plane myself and fly over to Germany and shake 7 bales of hay out of her. So she is still, yeah, very feisty. And what I was trying to do, I would like to clarify what I was trying to do. Made notes here. the relationship with Mrs. Burton and her grandson, who was marrying Sylvia's daughter, I was worried that I was portraying Sylvia in a very stereotypical way, the curmudgeon which she had become, who has, in the end, has a heart of gold, and I didn't want to do that. I want to portray her as a prejudiced person who lives a life that is not based on the prejudices that were instilled in her. And I mean, we know everything that happened in the last few years. We know how difficult that is. But I would like to think that love can prevail.